the spark beneath Orion, the day the stars went quiet. The Union Council smelled like burned wires and cowardice. And Captain Avery Holtbourne, under a Kentucky sky, tempered in London storms, chewed cheap gum like it was an oath, and said, "If the galaxy won't fight for itself, then a bunch of humans will." And every alien in that vaulted hall flinched as if courage were a contagious disease. Hours later, our rust-boned ship Odyssey knifed through the Orion hush, with a British Marine named Dax Murphy muttering gallows jokes, an Indian astrophysicist, Dr. Imani Kaur, feeding equations into a neural rig like a pianist on fire, and a single alien defector called Trin, seated behind blast glass, because trust had become a luxury. And as Rigel's light bled violet across our hull, the first Eidolon scout flickered on the scope here, then gone like a shark's smile under black water. So I threw power to forward shields and said hold, because sometimes the most human thing is to wait long enough to make the enemy wonder what you know. The swarm had erased 3 systems in a week, carving memory from matter, leaving behind dust that remembered it used to be people. And every sane species pulled its borders tight and practiced speeches about inevitable loss. But we learned our sanity on crowded streets and late-night diners, and Friday night, emergency rooms and airfields loud enough to drown doubt. So we didn't flinch when the scout reappeared inside our perimeter. A ghost in our gut stacks swore. Imani cursed under her breath in Punjabi English music, and Trin hissed a warning. They do not attack to win. They attack to teach you that winning never mattered. Which was, frankly, nonsense we did not have time for, because a second blip hatched into 9, and our hull sang with impacts like a church bell going mad. And still, we held, inching forward through a debris field that looked suspiciously curated, like the swarm wanted us to notice the torn flags and child-sized helmets drifting past. To wear our grief-like chains until Imani snapped, "Captain, the field's a lens," and the lens flexed, spilling us into a pocket of stillness where the veil, the swarm's mothership, loomed like an eclipse layered on an eclipse, the size of a small heartbreak and the color of old regrets. Then the veil spoke into our bones with a voice that felt like someone we'd failed. "Return to your cradle, small primates." And Dax laughed, because sometimes British laughter is a cutting torch. Then the veil took his laughter and repeated it back perfectly, empty and echoing, as if to say it knew the shape of all our bravery and found it quaint. And that's when Odyssey's lights guttered, and the temperature fell as our power drained into a lattice we couldn't see except, out of the corner of my eye, a ripple in the dark where starlight bent and didn't return. The way a lie never quite reflects the world right. So I yelled, "Mark it." And Imani burned a hole in the ripple with a pulse-timed flare, and for half a heartbeat the veil flinched like anything alive does when you stick a finger in its eye. We ran the numbers the way Americans run toward a disaster and Brits run a kettle to talk it over. And the math said one thing. The veil's core wasn't mechanical, it was grammatical. A grammar for reality that refused any sentence with emotion in it. A universe written without words like love, fear, or funny. And that was why every species that learned not to feel survived by not living, while humans, noisy and naked to the rain, built cities out of heartbreak and still sang after. So we aimed for the heart that hated hearts, and as we closed, Trin leaned forward, mandibles trembling, and confessed in a voice like dry leaves that the swarm had once been a safety system built by a species that feared its own anger, then gave their fear a spine and teeth, which is how all monsters are made. And I wanted to tell Trin we already knew that, because our history was a long argument with our worst ideas. But alarms shrieked boarding worms, nibbling through our hull like termites that believed in destiny, and Dax ran with a squad of drones, shouting T after, as if T could bully death into behaving. And Imani pulled a cable set no human hand had ever held with that much calm, and said, "Captain, when I go into the lattice, you keep me angry." And that was the first moment I believed we might live. Then the veil rippled again, and a whisper slid down my spine in my mother's accent, offering me a place without loss, a house where every light was forever green. And what terrified me most was how deeply I wanted it, because HFY isn't about never breaking. It's about breaking loud enough to wake your friends. So I told the ghost to piss off and killed our comfort heaters so the crew could feel their own breath frost in front of their mouths cold. Makes you honest. And the worms bored through bulkhead 7. Dax met them with cutting charges and a joke about true funds, and when one wrapped him in wire and needle, he kept laughing anyway, because the last thing you can do to a machine that doesn't understand laughter is laugh in its face. We punched atmosphere into the breach and blew the worms into the long night, then rammed the veil's inner membrane and slid inside a cathedral of angles that didn't add up, where gravity forgot itself and the floor was wherever your will was strongest. And Amani floated to the core interface like a comet, cables from her neuraloom flicking out like bright fish. And in she went, breath held, with me, on Whisper Comes, reading her story Cincinnati Fleets. Brixton mornings, the way old records crackle, the way soldiers roll their eyes when officers get noble feeding her, the roughness of us. Because the veil would try to smooth her down to a blank. Seconds stretched until they were thin as razor wire, and I kept talking. But my mouth went dry when her vitals dipped, and the core whispered back in her voice, "Captain, let go." Which is exactly what grief says when it tries to wear your boots. So I offered the veil a deal it could not compute. Take my fear, not my friend, and I meant it, and that meant something. Because the lattice shuddered like a rule being broken by its own exception. We felt the swarm hesitate, just for a breath. And in that breath, Dax, bleeding but smug, dragged in a satchel of stolen swarm notes, and said, "I brought you their ears." And Amani stirred, and said, "She." Listen, and through the nodes we heard the swarm's mind like rain on a tin roof. Millions of identical thoughts seeking cancellation. And somewhere a child's laugh though, one the veil had stolen from the council's memorial stream skipped like a flawed record. So Imani grasped that loop and pulled, weaving in a Kenyan lullaby her grandmother sang. Then a Glaswegian pub chorus, Dax barked. Then my dad's bad country hum. Then the quiet sob of a nurse in a midnight corridor who kept moving anyway, and the lattice didn't know where to put any of it. Because the grammar of a heartless universe doesn't allow chords. The veil screamed without sound, which is worse than sound, and hurled visions. A perfect earth without hurricanes or divorce or failure, an anthem written in straight lines. The promise that comfort is the same as joy, and I felt my knees soften, but then Trin, who had never seen a sunrise without filters, pressed their hand to the glass and whispered, "Keep your mess. It is your weapon," and that broke me in the useful way. So I grabbed the emergency lever we'd sworn never to use, a reactor overdrive that would turn us into a question. The galaxy would have to answer, and I told Imani, 5 minutes, and she said, "Give me 3, and Dax said, "As if time listens," and we laughed, because that's how we make fear move faster than us. Minutes, the slow kind, the kind with edges, bled out, while the veil learned too fast, and kept forgetting. Tried to take our pain and choked on the bones of our punchlines, and just when the reactor count hit red, and the hull sang high, and the ship wanted to die noble, Imani shouted, "Now," and unleashed a flood of tagged memories. Food you burn the first time you love someone. The ache in your shoulder, that means you'll live long enough to complain. Sunday league football on rain-ripped fields. The taste of coffee after bad news. Hands held in emergency rooms. The stupid, holy miracle of traffic restarting after. A wreck pumped through the swarm like sunlight poured into a cave, and the veil convulsed. And in its convulsion the scout nodes crashed into each other like birds startled out of formation, opening a wound in the great grammar where we could fit a human word. Nevertheless, I punched the drives. We speared that wound, and the veil folded in on itself like a lie caught on tape, and for a second I thought we'd made it. But suspense is honest, and never leaves early fields buckled. Bulkheads popped, something detonated aft, and Dax, still joking, shoved me toward the flight chair with a "Don't be a martyr, Captain, it's tacky," then sealed the door and dragged the satchel of nodes into the reactor room to scatter them like grit in a finely tuned clock. And his last transmission was a sigh, a chuckle, a calm, "Tell my mom I died arguing with a god. And I will, I promise." I did, and the ship screamed us back into the light. Outside, the veil wasn't gone so much as it was different, as if the idea of it had been rewritten by a messy margin note, and the swarm mind went from a choir to a market crowd, voices not aligned and therefore alive. And across Union space, distress calls became conversation, terror became decision, and we were still falling, heat ablating the paint off our name, until Odyssey was just a bright shard over Orion. And Imani came back to herself with a gasp, like a swimmer breaking surface, and I said, "You with me?" And she said, "As long as it's complicated," which is the most human. Yes, I know. We limped home on engines that sounded like regret, held together by spite and zip ties, and when the council convened again, the chamber didn't smell like burned wires, it smelled like rain on stone and hot tea and possibility. And the Yilon ambassador, who once warned us not to try, asked softly, "What do you call what you did?" And I said, "Tuesday, because humor is how we store courage for later." And when the Union asked for a doctrine, I gave them not a doctrine, but a story, that humans aren't strongest or wisest. We're merely the ones too stubborn to stop feeling, too cheeky to shut up, and that's enough, sometimes, to make a machine hesitate, and hesitation is a door you can kick open. There will be other swarms, other promises of painless futures, other lullabies with the hooks removed, and we will answer with scraped knees and bad timing, and a laugh that doesn't scan, with Americans who run headlong and Brits who keep the kettle boiling, and all our cousins everywhere who bring the noise. Because the dark is big and our spark is small, and somehow that's the point. Every 90 seconds of the long night, there's a fresh reason to be afraid, and every 90 seconds, we choose, noisily, not to be.